Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Scottish Independence Podcasts. A little bit different format for us this episode. Bill Ramsay, who, as you know, regular guest on the podcast, Bill had approached us because he had a presentation that he wanted us to help him with that he is going to give at a couple of events he's got coming up. And so that is really the first 40 minutes of this is Bill talking and taking us through what is actually a very interesting few slides. Then at the end, Marlene and I jump in and start chatting and asking him some questions, as the normal stuff that we do. The normal
stuff.
What about that? Yeah. What we're going to do is just go over to Bill in the studio and let him talk to us, and hope you find this interesting. We did. So
yeah, it is good. Very good.
I've been thinking about this for a long time. I mean, I was a former convener of the Equality Committee of the Educational Institute of Scotland, actually, for the best part of a decade. This idea I've been kicking around for probably 2 years, and I've now put it onto what I will say 3 slides. Probably the single most important impulse for me to do this was Professor Danny Dorling's book, Shattered Nation. And you can get his book easily enough. And also online, he does a lot of podcasts of various lengths on his book, Shattered Nation, and others he does. He's a Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford University. And he is a sort of social geographer, I think, where he looks at trends, inequality trends, economic trends, and how it impacts on people. And he talks about how things move through. And I actually, many years ago, come up with my own sort of very potted version of what Danny goes into in detail from an area that I'm in more my comfort zone, which is, as you know, geopolitical and military affairs. And it was this. In World War II, and I did this a few times as a sort of mini lecture with people, and it started, it was a technical term, from Admiral Nagumo to Elvis Presley. Admiral Nagumo was the commander of the Japanese task force that attacked Pearl Harbor, and of course Elvis Presley was one of the first leading post-war modern performers with a musical style that was, very different. And in a sense, the reason I chose Nagumo is because it kick-started an economic renaissance in the United States, the like of which we've never seen. Okay, it was war that caused it, and it ended up with an American working class and a particular phenomenon that, as far as I'm aware, had never occurred before in human history, which is the concept of pocket money for working class young people. Because by the 1950s, the working class of America was so relatively comfortably off that they could give their children pocket money. And that was a new thing. So that's why it went from Nagumo, and that because we saw an industrialization of the United States that gave women skilled work, gave black men skilled work, and gave the working class of America an income that actually sadly went into decline again and stagnated in the mid 70s with Reagan and so on, and Thatcher. Basically what happened was John Maynard Keynes' economic philosophy became the orthodoxy, both in the United States and in Britain and actually in the post-war Europe, where we saw a revolution, not a communist revolution, but although there were elements of things like the NHS were born in Marxism and so on, some would argue, but we saw a revolution in public services. We saw in Britain, and I think Britain's well, it's where we live, in the United Kingdom and in Scotland, and therefore that's the most relevant example for us. But what we saw was a relatively poor Britain with very little assets. The imperial assets were sucked up in the war, and certainly after the war we started to lose them. So it wasn't because of the imperial assets this occurred, but there was a determination of the government, possibly not for particularly ideologically sound reasons. They knew that if they wanted the British people to be all in a full-scale modern total war, they would have to give them some sort of prospect, something to fight for. In World War I, they'd argued for king and country, and by the late 30s and the Depression and so on, they knew that argument would have no traction. So if people were going to be all in a total war, they had to be given a vision. And the vision was given to them in short films from the mid-war onwards, where The people of Britain were offered a land fit for heroes, if you want to put it that way. And the government planned during the war to do a number of things, to introduce a massive programme of public housing, rented housing, which it did. The nationalisation of a number of industries, which it did. And the development of the welfare state, which it did. And in particular, the development of a national health service, which it did. All of this was underpinned and kick-started by Keynesian economics, which at the moment is seen as unorthodox, although we're now seeing, a turn to it. We'll maybe come back to that when we come to the third slide. But we saw the standard of living of people improve, ordinary people improve. Their opportunities for work, for education, for health improved. These are historical facts. These aren't theories. These are lived realities between 42 and roughly the late 70s. So we're not talking about a theory. We're talking about a lived reality. And us three, because of our age, were beneficiaries of that. And I'll use myself as an example. I was born into a family in what would have been described as a 4-in-a-block high amenity council house with a front and back garden. That is an upstairs and a downstairs, 4-in-a-block. Because my grandmother lived with us, my mum, my dad, me, and then my sister and my gran as well, because of our points within the system, when I was about 12 or something like that, we moved to a 2-in-a-block high amenity council house. Now, these had been built. Some of them had been built during the 30s. That's certainly true, but and earlier. So that we saw that public sector building program, which had started before World War II. That's certainly true. But we saw the NHS, we saw the education system, we saw the provisions improve to the extent that the peak year of public sector council housing, I think, was 1960. And I think it was under a Conservative Prime Minister. But certainly there was a consensus, both by the Labour and Conservative parties and governments, I think what they call Butskillism, named after Rab Butler and Hugh Gaitskell, the Tory and the Labour chancellors, I think, or shadow chancellors, one of them. Anyway, and so you had Butskillism, and we saw a consensus, and we saw improving living standards. As I say, Ramsay, in a 4-in-a-block high amenity council house, then Ramsay and my family in a 2-in-a-block high amenity council house. And then when I was 15, they introduced comprehensive education. In Scotland, it was known as the Rosler year, the raising of the school leaving age, and comprehensive education took hold. So people like me, who would normally have left school at the age of 15, were able to stay on at school and do O grades and then hires and then have the prospect of higher education. Now, as it happened, I was a bad boy, and although I went to Cathkin High, the year opened, and for my 4th year, I didn't get anything because I'd been at junior secondary beforehand, so I wasn't prepared for it. But here's the point. I left school. I had no problem getting a job in a department store in Glasgow. I didn't need any qualifications. I didn't need a CV. Indeed, my mother actually secured that post for me. And then the benefits of the welfare state and this road to peak equality kicks in for me. I go to night school. The reason actually then was actually not particular ambition, but because my job in a department store was not particularly well paid, but I only got one Saturday off in 4. So I started to go to night school, from the age of 16 to about the age of 19. And then I was able to go to Langside College and upgrade my hires in preparation going to university. And I got a grant. I got it for free. My dad was a signalman in the railway, a relief signalman, so he was one of the more higher paid semi-skilled workers in British Rail, a nationalised industry. And my mother was, she was a full-time housewife. She did not go back to work as a seamstress until my sister grew up a bit. But the point is, there was no financial challenge for me to go to further education college in Langside. I got a grant. And it happened, I moved home from a flat in the West End with some lads, and I got a grant, so I had that for a year. And then I went to Strathclyde University for 4 years. Again, no problem. I got a grant. I was living at home and I got a grant. I did not need to work, though I did have a Saturday job in the barras for 4 or 5 years, so that helped. But I did not need to work. There was no juggling a part-time job in a bar or the retail trade or somewhere like that with my university education. I was able to overtake that, and the state paid for it. When I left the university, and then I went to Jordan Hill College, and I did another postgraduate year to train as a teacher. So I had 6 years of full-time education and absolutely no debt. The state paid for all of that, all of it. So there was no problems in that regard. Then I became a teacher. And then I progressed, you could say, into the middle classes. I got a wee flat in Kilmarnock, in Glasgow. No, Kilmarnock, my first wee flat. I don't remember having to scrimp or scrape to get the basics of for a mortgage. I then progressed on to bought properties and so on. But none of this presented me with any economic challenge. And all of that occurred from 42 to 78. Now, this is another thing that Denny Dowling points out. By the late 70s, other countries are looking at the working class of Britain, and they're seeing them among the most relatively well off in the developed world. There were 2 or 3 countries a wee bit better. There were outliers that were a bit better, but you had people from the Nordics. You had academics, you had politicians, you had civil servants coming from the Nordics, which we look up to. And they taking notes, going away and implement what they saw in Britain. So that road to peak equality was achieved, and it saw the economy grew modestly during that time, and there were some issues. I won't get into the details. Maybe we can get the details later. But there's a myth around what happened to the Callaghan Labour government in the late 70s. They're going for a loan to the IMF. Britain being economically stuffed. In reality, they got a loan. They got a loan guarantee from the IMF. They didn't. They got a line for a certain amount of money. They actually only borrowed half of it, and within 2 years it was paid off. So it wasn't the crisis that they said. Anyway, that's broadly the story of slide number 1. Danny Dorling, indeed, lived in a high amenity council house in Oxford, as it happened at the time. And as one of its most senior professors points out, that some of the best tenured academics in Oxford, they couldn't afford to buy that former council house he was brought up in. 79 to the banking crisis, and a bit beyond actually, I suppose you could say is a period of my working life. And we're seeing the standards of living decline. We're seeing a public spending decline. We're seeing the standards of living of many people go down quite significantly, but it's very gradual. A colleague of mine in the EIS often uses the term, and it's used in politics from time to time, of the boiling frog. If you gradually boil the frog, you can boil it and it won't notice as the temperature gradually goes up. And you could say that from 79 to 2008, certainly, we were in things were getting worse. I later became a senior lay official within the EIS. I was a principal teacher, but I was seconded full-time around about 210. And I'd seen it before. But in local government, all over Scotland and in England, we were seeing what we would call efficiency savings in local government. It wasn't called cuts. It was called efficiency savings. We'll save a bit of money here, save a bit of money there, because budgets are, inverted commas, tight. In reality, we were in a decline, but it was very gradual. And it was not particularly noticeable. And in the political class, it was not particularly noticeable either. I mean, take myself. Even after, it wasn't until I retired that I really saw the crisis with more eyes, and I'll come to that when we do come to the third slide later on. But the decline was gradual. And because of Thatcher, Reagan, privatisation, and the rise of neoliberalism, as it says on that, the public purse got smaller. The assets that belonged to the state were sold off. Indeed, we'll remember when Thatcher came in, the left of the Tory party were described as rivets, who probably still believed in the previous, Butskellism. And they complained of Thatcher selling off the family silver. And I think that phrase from a Tory, a landed Tory, actually sums it up really quite well, because public sector assets were sold off. And the most egregious example is probably the water industry down south. And it's the most graphic example. Fortunately for us, the grey men of Scottish local government saved us from that, because the referendum and the Scottish public decided not to, they decided they would keep our water industry under public control. Now, it's got its issues, but it's not nearly as bad as they are down south. And I suppose, in a sense, the political consensus of Scotland resisted that. Across the board, Scotland resisted that. Even as a union activist, I saw the Tories under Michael Forsyth, they didn't push quasi-privatisation in our education system the way that was pushed down south. And in some ways, the resistance to that by the Scottish political community, I would say across a broad spectrum, to full-blown Thatcherism was one of the reasons why I supported independence and continue to do so, because Scotland is that bit, its culture is that bit to the left of the culture in England. In Wales is a different matter, but certainly in England. And we won't get into the reasons for that, but it seems to be the case when we look at the indicators and the voting intentions. And so gradually things got worse. And I saw that when I became a full-time union official around about 2010, where, for instance, up until then, women teachers were allowed to have quite flexible contracts were relatively common. And when I became a full-time LA secretary in my area, one of the first issues in LA from January to the summer of 2010 was the following. Women teachers, of which there are a lot, the majority in primary, 90%, nowadays the majority in secondary then, but roughly it was 50-50 in the secondary sector, were being told, right ladies, it's a decision time. You know that temporary contract that you're on where you're allowed, flexible contract, not temporary, flexible contract, it was a full-time contract, where because of childcare facilities, you can down to 3 days a week and then later put it back up to, your 5 days a week. Well, you're going to have to make a decision. You're going to have to decide now whether you're staying at 3 days a week or whether you're going up to 5 days a week. Now, that was important to hundreds of members that I had in the EIS branch in South Lanarkshire, as many other authorities. It wasn't a catastrophic decision. It wasn't a decision that got the headlines in the news, but it was occurred because the authority could no longer afford to do so, because the public purse was shrinking, partly because the assets were being sold off. And so we saw a decline in those standards, of those rights for public sector workers in particular. But it was very gradual, and because the unions are very strong in the public sector, it was somewhat resisted. And because most local authorities in Scotland were not conservative, it wasn't implemented full-blown the way it was down south to that extent. So we saw that gradual decline. And then with the banking crisis in 2008, and things started to become worse. We're not going into the economics of that. It's not disputed that things got worse, but how worse is really for an economic podcast, of which there are many. You might want to go into that with some of the economists that you have on. But that decline became a bit steeper. And this is where I would, I'll come to it in the next slide, where I would compare myself and my life, my lived life, to the life of many politicians who don't quite get it. But I would argue post-COVID, and this wasn't because of COVID. Although it really kicks in then, it's not because of COVID. Politics starts to change. We see public sector cuts getting worse. The analogy I use is the analogy from cinema. You have a film about a submarine, and the submarine has been depth charged. So the submarine captain decides to settle on the bottom of the sea in a fairly shallow part, and the submarine goes down and down, and then it settles in the bottom of the sea, and the superstructure of the submarine starts to creak because of the pressures. And that's, in a sense, what we saw with the economy and with society, as people's lives, particularly people at the bottom of the economic scale, got worse. I saw that happening in schools. And schools are just one example, but it's indicator I know best. When young people, as we put it, young people, as I would say as a union official, turn up to school and they've got a smile on their face, they are predisposed, they're better predisposed to learn. Anybody will tell you that. You don't need to be a teacher to work that one out. And if you've got a community where the young people are in households where things are quite stable, they are more predisposed and be in a position, they don't face distractions, and the learning environment they're in is that bit better. If, on the other hand, you're in a community where young people and their families are struggling, then they bring those struggles into schools with them, and therefore their performance dips a bit. And that's just one example, but in many others, people's health dip a bit, their mental health dips, their health in general dips, and it reinforces. And because of that, there's more demands in the public sector, but there's less money, so we get into a spiral. And I would argue for the last few years, that spiral is where we are. And to go back to the analogy of the submarine, we're in the era of the rivets popping. Like in the submarine, the superstructure is groaning, and some of the rivets start to pop, and water starts gushing in, and they're having to plug the gap, and there's a real crisis for the submarine. And economically, that's where we are, but not just in Scotland, not just in the UK, not just in Wales, but a lot of places in Europe. We won't get into the United States, but the United States is a way of normalising that culturally, subtly, many years ago. And because we low voter turnout many years ago. What we're seeing is that crisis, and we're seeing discontent among ordinary people because of that, because these multiple crises. And this is a point about the political mainstream. And my own experience of that, I think, can speak to that. I'm now retired, but I'm still active in the EIS. I'm still active in the local trade union council, still active in the trade union movement, convener of the SNP trade union group, but I'm still very active. But I'm now retired. And because of that, I use my bus pass more. When I was an official and travelling about, I would use public transport, but we usually use a train. Where I live in the south side of Glasgow, there's a train station around the corner. I would use a train. So there's many things that I have seen with my own eyes that I didn't see when I was using the train. And where I live in Albert Avenue in Glasgow, there's two bus routes. I can go left and go to Vicky Road, or I can go right and go to Pollokshaws Road. And the bus experience of standing at the bus stop in Vicky Road and getting on the bus, and the bus experience of standing in the bus stop in Pollokshaws Road and getting the bus are quite different. I see people who are really struggling when I go to Vicky Road. I see incidents occur on the buses, which causes problems. And if I go to Pollokshaws Road, there's much less of that. In Vicky Road, I'll see people who are in distress, who are homeless, who are begging. Pollokshaws Road, you don't see it. I mean, I sometimes describe my area when I turn right, and Pollokshaws is hipster central. Although there's a subtle bit to the hipster central as well. The young people, the people who would have been like me, and I've got a friend, I'll not name the friend, but this friend has got a son who's in his late 30s, who had a brilliant career at school, a brilliant career at university, a first, a brilliant academic career, a PhD, then got a job as a civil servant, commensurate with his PhD in Oxford, funnily enough, who recently took redundancy and has moved back to Scotland because although he had all those stellar qualifications and a post in the government as a civil servant in Oxford, he was still living in a bedsit. And it's not as extreme for the young people here because of things that the Scottish government have done, like, tuition fees and things like that, because the Scottish government has delivered many mitigations that the UK government has not, that have made things a bit better or less worse than it is down south, but it's still very bad. But the point is this: when I was using the train, I wasn't seeing this. Now I see it. And I do believe politicians right across the political spectrum are not seeing with their own eyes some of the worst of it. And I'm not blaming them, though they should start to look out for it, because, I didn't see it. I didn't quite see it either because of my lived experience. And I think that's really quite important. I can maybe, if I can turn to Reform UK and Restore Britain, if we look at the top left-hand side in the first wee dot of the decline that goes from 79 down to 2008. And instead of doing a line that goes right down to 2008, we take a line in another colour that goes straight along the screen, basically, right along the screen. During that period, because it was not seen as traumatic or really that significant, and rightly so, a whole series of legislation was passed by progressive governments, both in Scotland and in England and elsewhere, introducing into law rights over various things, equality rights of various types, and some rights to public services. And I saw this, and I was part of it because as convener of the Equality Committee of the EIS, I would take part in conferences endorsing these new laws introduced either by the devolved government or the UK government. The 210 Equality Act, which was Labour's parting shot when the Blair government finished. They actually mischievously, in a sense, introduced, I think it was Harriet Harman was the minister in charge, introduced poverty as an equality characteristic. But the Conservative government, when they come in, immediately, I think it was the Conservative Liberal Democrat government, when they come in, took away the protected characteristic of poverty. Now, those rights were given and many other laws were introduced as well, but we were in a condition of slight decline. So maybe I'm at fault as well. Maybe I should have said, look, we're introducing these new laws, which are laudable, but they aren't really backed up by the resource to ensure that they're applied properly. And that is part of the problem we're in today. That line of rights still continues. It goes straight on, and the divergence between resource and rights has become a gulf. And that has bred, in my view, cynicism. That the politicians say one thing, but they don't deliver on the rights that people have. Disabled rights is a good example. We've got rights to this, rights to that, but they're not resourced properly. The government's breaking its own laws effectively because it's not got the right, it's not backing up the resources. All of that generates cynicism at best, and at worst, worse than cynicism. And so I believe that the far right pick on that, and they often focus on those issues. And an example might be, and I think reform may well go down this sort of path. One of the rights that was introduced, and I view as a convener of the Equality Committee, I reckon it was a good one, which is the presumption of mainstreaming. In other words, people who have learning difficulties, particularly mild to moderate learning difficulties, if they should be taught in the same classroom as mainstream, so to speak. However, if the support assistants aren't there to support the people with whatever disabilities there are, then that's going to cause logistical challenges in the classroom. And we're now seeing things occur in classrooms that, because there's cuts to the number of teachers, and particularly the number of support assistants, we're now seeing rights not being delivered properly, not because the teacher doesn't want to, not because the school community doesn't want to, but they don't have the resources to do it. And we'll see people who work there turn around and say, well, I've got the bruises to prove, that there are issues here, and I can't be expected to, literally take the bruises or take the stress because we don't have the resources to deliver what technically people are entitled to get. And I think reform will come up with simplistic solutions, which are not solutions at all, based on real grievances from time to time. And people will listen to them because they'll turn around and they'll say, you are a hard-working working class family. Your child came home from school today. Your child told you that there was disruption in the classroom, and that disrupted their teaching and learning. In other words, this disrupted child was not removed, and therefore disrupted the learning. So we're seeing rights and we're seeing resources, the lack of the resources clash. And unless we go back to, I would argue, the Keynesian model, then this era of the popping rivets is going to get worse and worse, because I would argue, and it's not because I'm getting older, although I thought at first maybe that was it, that over the last few years, the political climate in Britain and in Scotland is getting worse. We're seeing more extreme things happening. We're seeing demonstrations occur in communities over grievance and solutions that are not solutions at all, that are actually the opposite of solutions. That's made worse, of course, the social media and information and disinformation, how that's handled. That makes it worse, how people's fears and concerns are fed on. And so we're in this era of the popping rivets, and all of the political community needs to think carefully and needs to come up with solutions, because the neoliberal model, the idea of grow the economy, that particular iteration of grow the economy clearly doesn't work. You just look at the evidence. And if you were to go back to the first slide, well, the economy grew, and it was based on, a Keynesian view of economic growth, and you've had other speakers on talking about that. And that's the essentials of my 3 slides, which I don't think, I think it's evidence-based, and again, great thanks to Danny Dolling and others in that regard. A shout out, I would say, to Gary Stevenson, who's Gary's Economics. In many ways, I think that's quite good, and also Richard Murphy. They don't agree with everything, but I think their economic underpinnings in their own way, underpin a lot of what I've said. In Scotland, we're going to see significant challenges for incumbent councillors. In my party, the Scottish National Party, we've got over 400. And the kitty is pretty much empty now. And unless, the Scottish government, and it's not just the UK government, the Scottish government come up with more imaginative ways of revenue raising, that's going to cause real problems at the local level. Because another thing, I think, with social media is you're going to see the rise of small campaigns in a local area that could deliver a result in an award, for instance. And because of the resources of the political right, and people underestimate this. I was at an STUC summit, well, it was a multi-day conference about the far right and how they operate. It was quite frightening. The supporters of the far right, the millionaire backers, will spend significant amounts of money in doing the following. They will legally purchase the swiping data from mobile phone companies. It's legal. And from that, they can discern people's likes, dislikes, and they can also discern issues that they can latch into, and then they can further reinforce it. They can then set up some sort of, in a local area, for instance, they could, it was put to us at the conference that they will operate in what they call a medium-sized town, and they will be able to identify people who support certain particular views and mobilise them to turn up at a particular place on a particular Saturday to protest. So they will reach out to them, they will come up with a trope. That trope or that excuse will then be retweeted or get a lot of views. They'll know that it's popular, they know it's been listened to, and then they'll curate and put other stuff. And so gradually they will build up a follower base on, through social media. They won't have the contact details, There won't be any institutions for them to join. Well, not at that stage. And then maybe they'll turn up outside a hotel. And that's where they will link. They will see each other, they will link, and organisations will be born of the far right at local level. Now, I'm told that the durability of these organisations is not particularly high, that they'll come and then they'll wane, and then they'll come and then they'll wane in different areas. But I think we're going to see that. We're going to see that increasingly. They'll pick communities, and that will have an effect. And as a political mainstream becomes less popular, and this is a point about my party as well, although we won the Scottish Parliament elections, our turnout slumped hugely. And in the coming period, the SNP will have to turn to that. So although the result of the Scottish Parliament election was a victory for the Scottish National Party of a sort, we shed hundreds of thousands of votes. And if we're going to get independence, then we need high turnouts. That's not a route to independence. It might have got us over the line with the Greens a few months ago. But if we are in the age of popping rivets, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So how do we turn this around? Can we turn this around? Because that downward spiral that you're describing, I completely recognise what you're saying. And I think we can see evidence of it all around us. And the Scottish government's in a particularly difficult position because of our situation as a devolved Parliament without control of our own levers, that they too are selling the family silver. Our land or our resources are getting stripped just to keep the thing going, and that is not a good way to go forward. I mean, we've had this recent issue about the bond issue, which is going to enrich banks and foreign investors. It's not going to enrich the people of Scotland. It's going to give them a ready pot of money to put some plasters on. So do you see any route, to reverse this trend at all?
The bond issue, I think, is a good example. Wearing my convener of the trade union group hat on, we had a members meeting and we endorsed the idea of what I will call a people's bond. That has been devised by, the currency group and people like that. And that has to be said, within the independence movement, I'll call it in the bigger bubble, since 2014, a number of organisations have emerged with people with real skill sets, real experience, real expertise that, frankly, the Scottish government is not paying attention to. And the Scottish government, in some ways, has had a degree of lobby capture. It listens to the lobby far too much. And they've got their bond. I've heard some people refer to it as a banker's bond, but we're putting forward, and hopefully with other branches, the idea of the people's bond. And if they want to continue with the other one, then fair enough. But we need to have not only, and I'm speaking from an SNP point of view, not only such a motion passed, we've had similar virtuous motions passed in the past about various things, but implemented by the Scottish Government. It's no longer enough for the Scottish Government to allow the members to pass an ideologically sound motion and then just leave it in the shelf. You've got to take it forward, even if it creates difficulties with some of the vested interests, particularly the wealthy and powerful vested interests of Scotland, which the Scottish Government has taken a less than bold route in relation to them. And frankly, and Nicola may well have taken a soft route with some of them. Humza and John have to some extent, but so did Alec. So in that sense, if you take local government reform, I think we're getting 2 extra bands onto the council tax. That's Band-Aid stuff that you were talking about earlier on. We need we need the local government council tax system to be overhauled. But again, they need wealth taxes and other things. And the Scottish Government, in my view, needs to start to literally pick some fights with some vested interests.
Exactly. And I mean, I've kind of lost track of the number of podcasts, Fiona, where you and I have said, look, we just want Scott Govan or Mr. Swinney, whoever it was, to pick some fights. Because, I mean, surely, okay, so you might do something about starting to bring in, a way of taxing land. and we know there's loads of lobbyists, and they are powerful, who come in and they'll really push back against that. And I just think, well, yeah, so that's a fight. Even if you lose the fight or can't do as much as you said you wanted to do, that's still you can make that into a win from the point of view of presenting Scotland's, the way that ScotGov's hands are tied behind their back. It can be presented as look, you see what's just happened. We could not do anything about that because we haven't got the powers. And I just don't understand why they aren't doing it more.
The other big change, obviously, this week is we have a new Prime Minister. Have you any indication that Burnham is going to be any less right-wing and neoliberal than the ones that have come behind him? Because there's nothing that I've seen yet that's any different from what we've had. So is he just going to continue the spiral? In which case, that's our argument, again, for getting out of this union and doing it a different way.
Well, when was his first full day as Prime Minister? Yesterday?
Yeah, yesterday.
So this is day, we're recording
he's
this.
He's not fixed it yet.
We're recording this in day two of Burnham's Prime Ministership. And his rhetoric is certainly to the left of Starmer. And some of his early appointments are interesting. The Scottish Government had better watch out, because if Burnham pivots to the left and the Scottish Government pivots to the left after Labour pivot to the left, then we'll get the sort of pasting, that's SNP, that we got at the last general election, only at the next Scottish election. That's the point. So if they're being Machiavellian about it, hanging about and waiting for Labour to move to the left, and then, and us as well, it won't work.
They certainly do need to move to the left, because the Scottish Government is drifting to the right, certainly in its economics. That other guy that they appointed, Healy, was it?
John Healy.
Yeah, who resigned because not enough money was being poured into defence, by which we mean arming the rest of the world and encouraging armed conflict for the good of the economy. That is not a left-wing position. That their entire industrial strategy under Starmer was built around putting us on a war footing and generating munitions. That's not a left-wing proposal.
Well, no, it's not. But we could do a complete different podcast, because that definitely is in that sort of area.
I want to show you this. This is one of the graphs from Danny Dorling's book. It's about income inequality. Now it's reflecting what you had on your first theme that you had through all those three slides. So it's 1961 to 2020, and you can see income inequality goes shooting up. That's when Thatcher and neoliberalism were there. But I just wanted to also just look at this one. That is what happened when the Labour government were in power, right? So again, it's about income inequalities, and they did nothing. Well, it went up and down a bit. One of those is whether you include, cost of housing in it, and then it coincides with Margaret Thatcher asking what her greatest achievement had been, and she says Tony Blair and New Labour, we made them change their minds. So because when I heard you talking about 1942 through to 1978, at the back of my mind, I've got a little assumption running which says, well, okay, so Thatcher and it got awful, but then surely it got better from 1997 through to 2010, at least a bit, when Labour in control. But obviously they didn't. So, I mean, what's behind that? Did they just want to ignore some of their voters?
No. Well, the New Labour project is a thing in itself, and what Danny Dorling says is that things just sort of flatlined to some extent. And remember, before the 2008 banking crash, the financial situation, was a bit different. Well, in terms of the trade union movement, the New Labour project Thatcher actually saw the trade union's power cut massively. And in that sense, that was the thing of Thatcher. She actually used the revenues from North Sea oil to pay men of working age when they were made redundant, effectively gave them levels of benefits when they reached a certain age, which stopped them from revolting, if you see what I mean. She literally did that. She deindustrialised and focused on the City of London. I mean, her impact on Britain was baleful. And in Scotland, people sort of got that for a whole series of reasons. But it's only recently, with the popping rivets, have realised the real damage she actually did in terms of, as a wet Tory said, selling off the family silver. Yeah. An important aspect to this, in my view, is higher education and the way it dealt with economics and how it fed through to the mainstream media, how certain things became accepted. One of the best examples is Question Time, and the way, and I think the National does a good job in this, and the way that Fiona Bruce jumps on someone as soon as they move outside the Overton window, particularly on the left. You know, when it's Farage who's been on Question Time, God knows it's a bit different. But as soon as someone in Question Time moves outside what they call the Overton window on the left, Fiona Bruce feels it's necessary for her, like some sort of medieval potentate or bishop or ideological religious person, saying, you know, that's heresy. You can't talk about that. You know, that's off the wall, or, you know, that's not serious. And I think the mainstream media are part of the problem in terms of what they consider is allowed, it can be spoken about. And the Today programme is one of the worst examples. The Burnham government's goal, what's going to be really interesting there, is the extent to which the mainstream media say, oh, you can't disturb the bond markets, and they never explain what it is. And you will see statistics being given by economics editors in the BBC and Channel 4. Certain indicators are given and they don't explain it. What they're being sort of potty trained into believing this is acceptable, that is not acceptable.
The thing is that the Overton window itself has moved. I mean, it's moved to the right. There are things are now kind of that wouldn't have been said too far right that are now acceptable within. I mean, they're said in the House of Commons, they're said on TV programmes. That's part of it.
Oh yes, I mean, I think that's quite important. But I think, maybe it's because it's a programme that I would have watched and shouted at a lot as a political activist, which is, particularly as an independent supporter, is Question Time. You know, that's not credible, says the chair, and that's extraordinarily powerful. And you don't say you can't say it. They say, that's not serious. You know, this is serious politics. This is in the area grown up and all the rest of it.
Who in the Scottish government does this fall on to fix?
No, lot. I mean, all of them. I mean, it's a matter. I mean, I think it's the entire Scottish government. It's the First Minister. It's the Cabinet Secretaries. It's actually the Scottish Parliament, and I think there needs to be a bit of more open discourse within the ranks of the backbench of the Scottish National Party.
And is that something that through your role in things that you can get that conversation happening? Is it already happening?
Well, there is a cultural problem, because I've been a member for decades within the Scottish National Party, that the leaders of the SNP, from Alex Salmond through Nicola, through their successors, have used. When I was first inactive in the SNP, and when I first started my activism in the SNP, when I became a teacher in 1982, the SNP were behind, remember the Liberal Democrats, David Owen and all of them? The SNP were around about 13% in opinion polls. We were fourth in Scottish elections, behind the Liberal Democrats. In those circumstances, the SNP saw itself as 2 or 3 parliamentarians, a clutch of councillors in choppy, dangerous electoral seas. And therefore, party discipline was paramount, because they could not afford to have a more open discourse. That culture, I think, continued within that discipline continued within the SNP, to some extent understandable, because we have the Prime Directive. We have to focus on this. Any dissent moves us from the Prime Directive. But we are now in a new politics, and it's affecting Scotland as much as anywhere else. And that discourse among the parliamentarians needs to open up. You even see it within the Labour Party today, this second day of the Burnham government, and you're seeing Starmerites briefing against them within 24 hours of them getting in. There is a discourse. Now, that's seen as, oh, well, if the public see it is divided. So, there's an issue there. But if we, having a lack of discourse is a real problem, because if you don't have a credible route forward, with a credible route to get to the election, in my view, that worked in an electoral sense. But that's gone. That's history. We're now in a new paradigm of, say, the pot and rivets, and there needs to be a more open discussion within the party. I'm not trying to come up with solutions. I'm trying to come up with, here's where we are. And unless we face up to those challenges, have that open discourse, the popping rivets, they're just going to see more and more popping rivets.
I would argue that that's wider than just an SNP discussion.
Oh, it is.
I mean, as we're recording this just now, tonight's premiere comes from a discussion that took place in the European Parliament on the 10th anniversary of Brexit. All four parts of the UK are represented. Plaid Cymru and the Sinn Féin representative both laid out really inspiring, positive, constructive action that's been taken at country level, not just a party, not just with a particular perspective, but in their respective countries, about that's going to take over the next couple of years. In the Welsh case, it's leading them towards thinking about independence. In the Irish case, it's leading towards thinking about how United Ireland would function. They're doing it on a topic by topic basis, like how would the NHS work in a United Ireland? Wales is like, well, how would this work in an independent Wales? We are not doing anything. This is a conversation we could spend the next 2 years having. What kind of country do we want to be, and what do we have to do to make it that country? Because the act of pulling people into that discussion, getting people with different views around the table, helps them move forward, and it actually builds consensus for a better future. And if Ireland can do it and Wales can do it, Scotland can do it as well. We just need probably the government to kickstart it, but then to set up a 2-year commission or whatever. That's how the Welsh did it. They've got an independent commission in Ireland as well. That's the level of debate we should be having. And England probably won't have that, because they're in a very, very different place right now, culturally, emotionally. So their society is just in a different place, politically for sure. So,
and I mean, as well as building confidence, it also builds trust. If you do that, between people, in particular, trust between people who don't agree with each other. It's a bit like what you've already said, Bill, but it's a good sign, isn't it, when people who disagree can sit down and have a decent discussion about a topic, and maybe one moves a little bit and the other one moves a little bit, and those kind of, if that's what we need to be doing here. And when I heard those Welsh and Irish politicians talking when we were over in Brussels, I was sitting thinking, well, I know there's been lots of things that have happened over, the last 12 years since the referendum. I mean, there's been the whole Brexit paralysis of politics, and then there was COVID. So, it hasn't been easy. But actually, I do think that ScotGov and the SNP have wasted time. And if they'd moved a couple of years back even, we could be in a much better place to be working towards setting up a referendum. Sinn Féin and the Irish politicians are thinking 2030 for a unification border poll. Well, we need to put in a hell of a lot of hard work between now and then if we were to have an independence poll in 4 years' time.
Your point you make about the Scottish government is perfectly valid. But the Scottish government and the Scottish National Party have got to understand that we shed hundreds of thousands of votes in an election that we won. Now, winning an election and shedding hundreds of thousands of votes is something that has to be phased up to, and it's not nice, but it's got to be done, or it's got to be ignored. And if it's ignored, it's going to get worse. And that comes back to the era of popping rivets. You've got to address the trust across the parties is one thing, but in a low turnout, see, there's a sweet spot here for people of the centre right, which is low turnout is virtuous. That's the secret of American politics. The Democrats and the Republicans like the fact that half the Americans don't vote, that poverty is a law enforcement issue. And so they can ignore and curate their media. So we'll have a low turnout and eviscerate the working class. That's a prospect. That's worked in the United States, and it could be applied here. So
yeah, it could, but it wasn't what happened in Wales. It's reasonable to kind of say, well, there is a connection with the fact that Wales now have Plaid Cymru as their government and a first minister.
I think your point,
and connect back to the 2 years that they spent going around Wales asking people what kind of country they wanted.
Exact point about Wales in particular is really important. At the moment, the Welsh sort of look up to Scottish politics. Well, in reality, it looks to me increasingly that the Welsh are coming up with some answers that we need to listen to.
We've only got a couple of years before you end up potentially with Farage as the Prime Minister.
Yes.
If we think it's bad now, it's going to be a hell of a lot worse when that happens. I think that's where we should be getting that moving.
I think the point about Wales is really important.
The way they are describing their aspirations for their country, it's inspirational stuff. You know, I really do think that's the right way to be approaching it. So that was a wide-ranging discussion, as we always have with Bill. Lots of areas that we will come back to in future podcasts. And just thanks very much for your time and for sharing your slides with us, Bill. It's been fascinating discussion, as always.
I think we give me the opportunity to actually get my ducks in a row, so to speak.
You're very welcome.
Or 3 slides in a row.
That's great.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out, so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.